The giant space station called Galactic University slowly turned in the darkness of space. Its metal walls shined under the light of 3 different suns. The station was bigger than most cities on Earth, and it was home to the smartest beings from across the galaxy. Students from hundreds of different worlds came here to learn the most advanced science and technology. Today was a very special day because the university was getting its first human student professor. Nail walked through the long hallways of the science building. His thin legs made soft clicking sounds on the metal floor. The Vithran people were tall and skinny with skin that looked like glass. Their bodies were weak, but their minds were incredibly smart. They had built some of the most advanced technology in the galaxy. Professor Nail had been teaching at the university for over 200 years. He had taught students from many different species, but never a human. He had heard scary stories about humans. They came from a world so dangerous that other alien species called it a death world. The professor stopped outside his classroom and checked his teaching materials one more time. His hands were shaking slightly. He tried to calm himself, but the stories about humans kept running through his mind. Stories about incredible strength. Stories about beings who could survive in conditions that would kill most other creatures. Stories about a species that had somehow built starships despite coming from a world of constant danger. The classroom slowly filled with students. There were the Quailans who looked like floating jellyfish made of light. They drifted through the air, speaking to each other in musical tones. The granite people sat heavily and specially made chairs. Their bodies looked like living rocks covered in moss. Some students looked almost human but had extra arms or different colored skin. Others were so strange that it was hard to tell where their bodies ended, and their clothes began all. The students were talking about the same thing, the human who was coming to their class. Most of them had never seen a human before. They had only heard stories. Some stories said humans were incredibly violent. Others said they were surprisingly kind. But all the stories agreed on one thing. Humans were different from every other species in the galaxy. The door to the classroom made a soft whooshing sound as it opened. Everyone turned to look. Quan walked into the room. He looked surprisingly normal to the alien students. He was not very tall by human standards, just under 6 feet. His black hair was cut short and neat. He wore simple clothes that looked plain compared to the advanced outfits worn by other students. But there was something about the way he moved that made some of the more nervous aliens shift in their seats. Quan walked with quiet confidence like he belonged everywhere he went. His eyes moved around the room, taking in all the different species, but he did not stare rudely. He seemed calm and relaxed, as if walking into a room full of aliens was perfectly normal. Professor Nail cleared his throat. His voice came out higher than he wanted. "Welcome, human Quan. Please take any seat you would like." "Thank you, Professor." Quan said. His voice was deep and steady. He chose a seat near the back of the room. As he sat down, the chair made a small creaking sound. The noise seemed to surprise some of the lighter alien species who weighed much less than humans. Quan pulled out a simple notebook and a pen. Several alien students stared at these basic tools. Most of them used advanced holographic devices that could record thoughts directly from their minds. But the human seemed perfectly happy with his old-fashioned writing materials. Professor Nael tried to regain his composure. Today we will discuss the physics of planetary formation. As most of you know, planets form under very specific conditions. Most worlds suitable for life have very gentle environments, with stable weather and comfortable temperatures. Quaylen's student raised one of her tentacles. "Professor, is it true that the humans' world has massive storms that can destroy entire cities?" Quan looked up from his notebook. He seemed slightly amused by the question. "We call them hurricanes. They are not that bad if you prepare for them properly." The classroom became completely silent. Not that bad. The weather reports from Earth described storms with winds strong enough to knock down buildings and floods that could cover whole cities. What did humans think was actually dangerous weather, Professor? Nail cleared his throat nervously. Yes. Well, Earth is what we classify as a Class 12 death world. The gravity alone is 3 times stronger than what most civilized species can handle. Most of us would be crushed flat just by standing on your worlds. Surface Quan shrugged his shoulders. It is just normal to us. You get used to it when you grow up there. As the lesson continued, the other students became more and more curious about their human classmate. During a break, several of them gathered around his desk to ask questions. Is it true that humans can run for hours without stopping? Asked a student from the granite people. Some humans can. I am not much of a runner myself, Quan replied. He seemed modest about abilities that sounded impossible to the other students. What about the stories we heard that humans can lift objects 10 times their own weight in emergencies? Maybe adrenaline is pretty amazing stuff. The alien students looked at each other with worried expressions. This human was talking about incredible physical feats, like they were everyday things. What kind of world created beings like this? How did they survive long enough to build a civilization? When class started again, Professor Nail decided to demonstrate something about planetary gravity. He had brought mineral samples from different worlds to show how gravity affected the way crystals formed. These crystals, from my homeworld of Vithros, are incredibly delicate, he explained while holding up a beautiful clear specimen that seemed to glow with inner light. They can only form in very low gravity environments. The slightest pressure would shatter them into dust. He carefully handed samples to each student, warning them to be extremely gentle. When it was Quan's turn, Professor Nail hesitated. Perhaps you should just observe this one. Human Quan. These crystals are priceless artifacts, and they are very fragile. Quan looked at the professor calmly. I will be very careful with it. I am sure you would try your best, but humans are known for their strength. Even your most gentle touch might be too much for something this delicate. The room grew quiet and tense. The other students could sense something unpleasant in the professor's words. It was not just about being careful. There was something else in his voice. Something that sounded like an insult. Quan looked at the professor for a long moment. His expression did not change, but something shifted in the way he sat. A slight straightening that somehow made him seem more dangerous. Even though he was still sitting calmly in his chair, Professor Quan said quietly, I can handle delicate things just fine. But Professor Nail, driven by his species pride and his fear of humans, made a terrible mistake. I think it would be better if you do not touch it. Humans are simply too primitive for such advanced materials. The word primitive hung in the air like a weapon pointed at Quan. The other students held their breath. They had heard stories about human pride, about how humans reacted when someone insulted them. But Quan simply nodded his head. I understand. He said. His voice was still, calm. But there was something underneath it now. Something that made the smarter aliens in the room feel nervous. As the class ended, the students slowly left the room. They whispered to each other about the tension they had just witnessed. Professor Nail felt satisfied that he had maintained proper safety protocols. He began packing his teaching materials, feeling proud of how he had handled the situation. Tomorrow he planned to use even more complex demonstrations, ones that would surely prove his point about the limitations of Deathworld species. After all, how could beings who spent all their time just trying to survive possibly understand the finer points of advanced galactic science? Professor Nail had no idea that his assumptions and insults were about to lead to a very painful lesson about what happened when you underestimated humans. The next day arrived with an unusual buzz of excitement throughout Galactic University. Word had spread quickly about the tension between Professor Nail and the human student. Many alien students from other classes had found excuses to visit the science building. Some even crowded into the viewing galleries above the main classroom, hoping to see what would happen next. Quan arrived at exactly the same time as the day before. He walked calmly to his usual seat near the back and sat down with the same quiet confidence. The chair creaked slightly under his weight, just like before. He pulled out his simple notebook and pen, completely ignoring the stares from dozens of curious alien eyes. The other students in his class seemed nervous. They whispered to each other in their various languages, wondering if there would be more conflict today. The Qualans floated higher than usual near the ceiling. The granite people had positioned themselves closer to the exits. Some of the smaller species, looked ready to run at the first sign of trouble. Professor Nail entered the classroom with an unusual spring in his step. Behind him floated several pieces of advanced equipment that the students had never seen before. These devices hummed with power and glowed with strange lights. They looked expensive and incredibly complex. Today we will demonstrate advanced field manipulation. Professor Nael announced, his voice carried further than usual and seemed to have extra confidence in it. This type of work requires not just intelligence but perfect finesse. The ability to make tiny adjustments that primitive reflexes simply cannot achieve. He emphasized the word primitive in a way that made it clear he was talking about humans. Several students glanced nervously at Quan, who continued writing in his notebook as if nothing had been said. Professor Nail activated the first device. It was a complex arrangement of floating crystals that responded to mental commands from the user watch. Carefully as I demonstrate quantum resonance manipulation. This requires perfect mental discipline. One stray thought, one moment of uncontrolled emotion, and the entire matrix will collapse and possibly explode. He began his demonstration flawlessly. The crystals started dancing in perfect harmony around his thin fingers. Colors flowed through the crystalline structure like liquid light, creating patterns of incredible beauty. The display was truly impressive and showed the advanced nature of Vithran technology. The other students watched in amazement as the professor made the crystals spin and weave through complex geometric patterns. The device responded to his every thought, creating a symphony of light and sound. Of course, Professor Nail continued while maintaining his demonstration. This technology was developed by the Vithran Empire over many centuries of careful research. It requires the refined neural patterns that only truly advanced species possess. Our brains have evolved. Beyond the crude survival instincts that dominate lesser species, a Qualan student raised one of her tentacles. Professor, could other species learn to use devices like this? Some species, perhaps, Professor Nail replied. Those that have sufficient evolution, beyond their base animal instincts. His eyes turned toward Quan. But species that evolved on Deathworlds developed neural pathways focused purely on survival, fight or flight responses, primitive fear reactions. They lack the mental subtlety required for true scientific work. The room became uncomfortable and quiet. Even the alien students who did not particularly like humans could recognize the deliberate cruelty in these comments. This was not education anymore. This was public humiliation designed to prove a point. Quan slowly set down his pen and looked up at the professor. Professor, may I ask you a question? Professor? Nail smiled widely, sensing an opportunity to further prove his point. Of course, human Quan. Though I am not sure you're primitive, Brain will understand my answer. You keep saying that humans are primitive and lack intelligence, but we did build starships capable of reaching your university. We do have our own quantum technologies. Does that not suggest we might understand these scientific concepts? Several students nodded, impressed by the logical and calm response, but Professor Nail waved his hand dismissively. Human technology is crude, barely functional garbage. You people brute force your way through problems rather than solving them with true elegance. Your starships are flying disasters held together by desperation, luck, and prayer. I see Quan's voice remained perfectly level. So in your educated opinion, humans contribute nothing of value to galactic civilization. Nothing. That could not be done better by proper civilized species, yes. That is correct. The words hit the classroom like a physical blow. Even by the standards of galactic academic politics, this was incredibly insulting. To dismiss an entire species as worthless was considered deeply inappropriate and unprofessional, but Quan simply nodded his head again. That is a very interesting perspective. Professor encouraged by what he mistook for the humans. Submission. Professor Nael decided to drive his point home. Even further, he activated a second device that was even more complex than the first. This machine created localized gravitational fields that could bend space itself. This device can create and control gravity wells, he explained with obvious pride. In the wrong hands, it could tear apart this entire section of the space station. It requires literally centuries of training and absolutely perfect mental control to operate safely. He began his second demonstration, causing small objects around the classroom to float and orbit invisible points in space. The effect was both beautiful and terrifying. Raw gravitational force was being bent to his will through pure intellectual mastery. Naturally, we would never allow a human anywhere near such dangerous equipment, Professor Nail continued. The risk to everyone would be— He paused for dramatic effect. Catastrophic. At that exact moment, the classroom door opened, and another human student walked in. This was Minho, a transfer student who had just arrived at the university. Professor Niall's eyes lit up with malicious opportunity as he saw his chance to make an even bigger demonstration. A perfect timing, Professor Niall said with obvious pleasure. Class, please observe carefully 2 specimens from the same Deathworld. Notice the heavy muscle structure clearly visible even under their clothes. Notice the thick, dense bones that developed to handle crushing gravity. These are obviously not the bodies of thinkers and scientists, but of manual laborers and primitive warriors. Minho stopped walking and stood frozen in the doorway. His face showed immediate shock, and then rapidly growing anger as he processed what the professor had just called him. Professor, Minho said, and his voice was dangerously quiet. Did you just call us specimens, scientifically speaking? Yes, Professor Nail replied with casual cruelty. You are both interesting examples of how hostile environments shape evolutionary development away from intelligence and towards simple brute survival. The gravitational manipulation device continued its demonstration with objects still dancing through the air around Professor Nail. He was clearly enjoying himself, completely unaware that he had just crossed a line that even the most patient human would never tolerate. Minho clenched his hands into fists, his whole body tensed with barely controlled rage. Several alien students moved further away, sensing the sudden spike in dangerous tension. Quan slowly closed his notebook and looked up at Professor Nail. For the first time since arriving at the university, his calm mask showed a tiny crack. Not anger exactly. Something much colder, much more calculating, and infinitely more frightening. Professor Nail, Quan said very quietly, I think you are about to learn something important about human intelligence. The professor laughed while still casually manipulating deadly gravitational forces. Oh, really? And what might that be? Primitive human. We are extremely good at identifying structural weaknesses, Quan replied. Something in his tone made every survival instinct in the room start screaming warnings. The floating Quellans immediately moved higher toward the ceiling. The granite people quietly shifted behind their desks. Even Professor Nail felt a tiny flutter of unease, but his arrogance was too strong to let him recognize the danger he was now in. Professor Nail continued his demonstration, completely unaware that the atmosphere in the classroom had changed from uncomfortable to genuinely dangerous. The gravitational fields danced around his fingers as he explained the complex mathematics behind their control. His confidence had reached levels that would have alarmed anyone with better survival instincts. You see, class, this level of precise control requires neural pathways that simply do not exist in survival-based species. The brain structure of a human is fundamentally different from civilized races, built for quick, violent reactions rather than careful, intelligent thought. Quan remained in his seat, but his posture had shifted in ways that only someone trained to notice such things would see. His hands now rested on his desk with very deliberate placement. His breathing had become perfectly controlled and steady. His eyes tracked Professor Nail's movements with mathematical precision, like a predator calculating distance and timing. For instance, Professor Nail continued moving closer to where the 2 human students sat. If I were to suddenly move toward one of them, their primitive fight or flight response would immediately take over. They would probably lash out violently before their higher brain functions could even begin to engage. He stepped directly in front of Quan's desk, bringing the active gravitational manipulator closer to the human's face. The device hummed with barely contained power, warping the air around it in visible waves that made the light bend strangely. Of course, any such reaction would be completely clumsy and ineffective. Humans might be physically strong by galactic standards, but they completely lack precision and finesse. They are like using a hammer when you need to perform delicate surgery. Minho started to stand up from his position near the door. His face was red with anger, and his hands were clenched into tight fists. But Quan raised one hand just slightly. The gesture was so small that only Minho caught it, but something in that tiny movement made the other human freeze in place. Professor Quan said, and his voice had taken on a strange quality that made several alien students unconsciously move backward. "You are making quite a lot of assumptions about human capabilities." Professor Nail leaned forward, bringing the dangerous gravitational device even closer to Quan's face. "Then prove me wrong. Show me this famous human intelligence that everyone keeps talking about." The challenge hung in the air like a loaded weapon ready to explode. Even the alien students who knew nothing about human behavior could sense that something terrible was about to happen. The floating Quellans had moved all the way to the ceiling. The rock-skinned students had quietly positioned themselves behind the strongest-looking furniture. Quan looked up at Professor Nael, with eyes that suddenly seemed much older and far more dangerous than anyone had noticed before. "All right," he said very quietly. What happened next took exactly 1.3 seconds and would be analyzed by alien physicists and military strategists for many decades afterward. Quan did not stand up. He did not even shift his weight significantly in his chair. Instead, he simply reached out with his right hand and very gently, almost casually grasped Professor Nail's extended arm just above the wrist. To Professor Nail, it felt like being grabbed by a mechanical press that had been disguised as living flesh. The pressure was instant, absolutely precise, and completely impossible to resist. His confident expression vanished, immediately replaced by shock and then rapidly mounting terror as he realized he could not pull away. "The thing about humans," Professor Quan said in a perfectly conversational tone, his grip remaining gentle by human standards but completely irresistible by any other measure, "is that we understand leverage physics and anatomy very, very well." Professor Nail dropped the gravitational manipulator, which clattered loudly to the floor and automatically shut down its safety systems, activating. He tried desperately to pull back, but it was like trying to escape from a statue made of steel. The human's hand had not even closed completely. Around his arm, just enough pressure to hold him absolutely in place. "You see, Professor, when you live on a world where literally everything is trying to kill you every single day, you learn to be extremely precise about applying force. Too little force and you die horribly. Too much force and you break the tools you desperately need to survive." Professor Nail's breathing became rapid and shallow. He could feel the incredible strength in the human's grip, held in perfect check. It was like standing next to a controlled nuclear explosion that could be released at any moment. "For example," Quan continued, his voice remaining calm and educational, "the Vithran arm has a very specific breaking point that we humans have studied extensively. Your radius bone right here can withstand approximately 47 pounds of lateral pressure before it fractures completely." Professor Nail's eyes went wide with absolute terror as he realized the human knew exactly how much force would be required to snap his arm like a dry stick. "Please," he whispered, I am not going to break it," Quan said, and several students released breaths they did not know they had been holding. That would be crude and primitive, would it not? But then his grip shifted slightly, and Professor Nail felt something that made his entire nervous system scream danger warnings. The human's fingers had found the exact pressure points where major nerves ran close to bone. However, Quan continued, "Humans are very good at understanding complex systems, like your nervous system, and your muscle structure, and your skeletal framework. We study these things because on our world, knowledge means survival." The pressure increased by tiny fractions. Each microscopic adjustment sent waves of discomfort shooting up Professor Nail's arm. Not actual pain yet, but the clear promise of pain. The threat of serious damage held in absolutely perfect control. The interesting thing about precision, Professor, is that it works both ways. I can calculate exactly how much pressure to apply to cause a hairline fracture that would heal perfectly in 6 weeks with proper medical care. Or I can calculate exactly how much pressure to apply to simply make my point clear. Professor Nail was visibly shaking. Now sweat was forming on his translucent skin. Despite the cool temperature in the classroom, the entire room had gone completely silent, except for the soft humming of the space station's life support systems. "So here's what is going to happen, Quan," said his voice never rising above a normal conversational level. "You are going to apologize sincerely to me and my friend here. You are going to publicly revise your ignorant opinions about human intelligence. And then we are going to continue this class like civilized, educated beings." He paused, letting the words sink in completely. "Or I can show you just how precise a primitive Deathworlder can really be when we put our minds to it." Professor Nail's response was immediate, desperate, and completely sincere. "I apologize completely and sincerely," Professor Nail gasped, his voice barely above a terrified whisper. The words tumbled out in a desperate rush, driven by the horrifying realization of just how helpless he truly was. "I was completely wrong about humans. Totally and absolutely wrong." Quan's grip loosened slightly but did not release the professor's arm. "That is a good start, Professor. But I do not think you fully understand the situation yet. This is not just about hurt feelings or wounded pride." Classroom remained frozen in absolute silence. Even the normally chattering Quailans had gone completely motionless, their translucent bodies dimmed with shock. No one in the history of Galactic University had ever seen a professor, especially a respected Vithran professor, reduced to this state of terror. "You called us specimens," Quan continued, his tone still perfectly conversational, but carrying an undertone that made everyone in the room feel their survival instincts activate. "You dismissed our entire species as inferior primitives. That is not just rude, Professor. That is genuinely dangerous." Professor Nail's legs were beginning to shake uncontrollably. He could feel his blood circulation being precisely controlled by the human's grip, not completely cut off but carefully regulated. It was a demonstration of control that went far beyond simple physical strength. "Dangerous," he managed to whisper through his fear. "Think about it from a scientific perspective," Quan said. "Humans did not reach the stars by being primitive or stupid. We got here by being very, very good at solving problems. And Professor, right now you have made yourself into a problem that needs solving." Minho stepped forward, his earlier anger now replaced by something that looked almost like professional curiosity. "Quan, are you using the Soul Academy pressure point technique, modified specifically for Vithran physiology?" Quan replied without taking his eyes off the terrified professor. "Had to account for their different nerve cluster locations and bone density." The casual nature of this exchange sent a fresh wave of terror through Professor Nail. They were discussing his anatomy. Like engineers discussing a broken machine. Soul Academy asked a brave Quailan student, her voice barely audible. "Human Military Science University," Minho explained matter-of-factly. "They study how to efficiently disable any known alien species without causing permanent damage, for peacekeeping purposes, of course." "Of course," Quan agreed. "Humans are exceptionally good at controlled applications of force. We have to be. Our world taught us that uncontrolled violence gets you killed very quickly." Professor Nail's mind raced desperately, trying to process this terrifying information. Military science universities. They had entire schools dedicated to studying other species' vulnerabilities. What kind of civilization were humans actually building? But that is not really the important point here. Quan continued. "The point is that you made assumptions based on prejudice and ignorance rather than actual evidence. That is very bad science, Professor." He adjusted his grip again, and Professor Nail felt his knees nearly give out as nerve signals fired in ways they were never meant to. His arm was going numb in very specific places while other areas became hypersensitive. "So let us conduct some real science. Question what happens when you underestimate an entire species that has spent millions of years learning to survive on a world that actively tries to kill them every single day." "I do not know," Professor Nail gasped. "Hypothesis. You get taught a very painful lesson about the difference between intelligence and wisdom." The professor's breathing was becoming increasingly ragged. He could feel his nervous system being manipulated with surgical precision. The human was demonstrating superior knowledge of Vithran physiology, while maintaining perfect emotional control. Method demonstrates superior understanding of the subject's physical and psychological systems while maintaining complete emotional control throughout the process. Quan's voice never wavered. never showed anger or excitement. If anything, he sounded like he was conducting an actual scientific lecture. Results. Subject experiences immediate attitude adjustment regarding previously held beliefs and assumptions. Please, Professor Nail whispered desperately. I understand now I was wrong. Humans are clearly much more advanced than I thought, are we? Quan asked. Or are we just different in ways you never bothered to learn about? See, that is what you never took the time to discover, Professor. You assumed that intelligence could only look one way. Your way. He gestured with his free hand toward the gravitational manipulator lying on the floor. You are very skilled with that device. Centuries of training, you said. But you know what? I understood exactly how it worked within the first 5 minutes of watching you use it. Professor Nail's eyes widened in complete disbelief. The mathematics behind it are actually quite simple, once you account for quantum field fluctuations. Your people just made it unnecessarily complicated because you think complexity automatically equals sophistication. Minho nodded in agreement. Human engineering philosophy. If it is not simple enough to repair during combat conditions, then it is over-designed and useless. But that is not primitive thinking. Quan continued. That is practical, intelligent thinking. We build things that work under extreme pressure because our world taught us that pretty solutions that break under stress are completely worthless. The professor was beginning to understand, and the realization was almost worse than the physical helplessness. These humans were not primitive at all. They were efficient, brutally, terrifyingly efficient in ways that his species had never even considered. So here is what is going to happen, Quan said, his grip shifting one final time. You are going to release a university-wide statement correcting your previous comments about human intelligence. You are going to personally recommend that several qualified human students be accepted into advanced programs, and you are going to request human advisors for the next major engineering project. Yes, Professor Nail agreed immediately. Yes, absolutely. Whatever you think is appropriate, I will do it. Good. Because, Professor, this demonstration has been me being gentle, human gentle. And if you ever insult my species again, in public you will learn what human precise actually looks like. Quan released Professor Nail's arm and calmly returned to his seat, picking up his pen as if absolutely nothing had happened. Professor Nail stumbled backward, cradling his arm against his chest. There was no visible damage, no bruising, nothing that would show up on any medical scans. But he would never forget the feeling of being completely at the mercy of something that could have destroyed him with casual ease. Now then, Quan said very politely, I believe you were explaining gravitational field theory. News of what happened in advanced physics class spread through Galactic University faster than a solar flare. Within just a few hours, every student, professor, and administrator on the massive space station knew about the incident. The story grew and changed with each telling, but strangely none of the versions made it sound worse than it actually was. The truth was already impressive enough. Professor Nail kept every single promise he had made while under Quan's grip. Within 2 days, a formal statement appeared on the university's official academic network. The message acknowledged his fundamental misunderstanding of human cognitive capabilities and requested that all his previous comments about human intelligence be completely disregarded. The statement was carefully written, professional, and clearly came from someone who had experienced a life-changing shift in perspective. But the real changes happening around the university were much more subtle and far more significant than any official statement. In the faculty lounge, Professor Zira, a highly respected Quellan scientist, floated near a group of colleagues who were discussing the incident. I have been reviewing human academic papers, she announced to the group. Their approach to quantum mechanics is absolutely remarkable. They solve in 5 simple steps what takes our best scientists 50 complex calculations. Those are just crude approximations, muttered Professor Venth, an elderly researcher from the Granite People. No, Sira corrected him firmly. Elegant simplifications. They identify the core principles that actually matter and ignore all the decorative mathematics that do not affect the final result. I have been overcomplicating my own research for decades. Similar conversations were happening all across the university. The human students, there were 7 of them in total, suddenly found themselves at the center of intense academic interest, not as strange curiosities to be studied, but as respected colleagues, whose different perspectives were actively sought out and valued. Yun Wu, a human studying xenobiology, was approached by Dr. Kellen, the university's leading expert on cross-species genetics. "I have been working on a protein synthesis problem for 3 years," the doctor admitted. "Would you mind taking a look at my research?" Hyun Woo examined the complicated research for only 20 minutes before suggesting a solution that Dr. Kellen had never even considered. The approach worked perfectly. On the first try, the method was so direct, so focused on practical results rather than theoretical elegance, that it had been completely invisible to researchers trained in traditional galactic academic methods in the engineering department. Sue Jin found herself recruited for an important project to design emergency systems for space stations. Her human perspective on survival scenarios, gained from growing up on a world where emergency preparedness was literally part of daily life, completely revolutionized their safety protocols. But perhaps the most significant change happened in Professor Nail's own classroom. 3 weeks after the incident, the same classroom was packed far beyond its normal capacity. Students from every department across the university had requested special permission to audit advanced physics. All of them wanted to observe the new collaboration between human and traditional galactic teaching methods. Professor Nail entered the room looking noticeably different. From before, he moved with much less arrogance and much more genuine curiosity. His entire teaching style had evolved from lecturing down to students to encouraging real discussion and debate. "Today we are going to explore gravitational field manipulation," he announced, using both traditional Vithran theoretical methods and human practical applications. Quan, who had become something of a celebrity, despite his obvious discomfort with all the attention, raised his hand. "Professor, would it help if I demonstrated the human approach first?" "Please do," Professor Nail said, and there was genuine respect and interest in his voice. Now Quan stood and walked to the gravitational manipulator. Instead of using the complex initialization sequence that Professor Nail typically required, he simply turned the device on and began adjusting the controls with quick, confident movements. "Humans do not memorize all the theory first and then try to apply it," he explained as he worked. "We learn by interacting directly with the system, feeling our way through it until we understand how it actually behaves." The device responded immediately, creating gravitational fields that were less mathematically perfect than Professor Nail's demonstrations, but far more stable and much easier to maintain under stress. "The key insight," Quan continued, "is that most systems are much more robust than their designers think they are. You do not need absolutely perfect inputs to get reliable outputs. You just need to understand which variables actually matter and which ones do not." A granite student raised one of his rocky appendages. "But how do you know which variables actually matter without first analyzing the complete mathematical model?" Quan grinned in that particularly human way. "You break things systematically until you learn what actually breaks them. Then you avoid doing those specific things." The casual admission that humans learned by deliberately breaking expensive equipment should have horrified the alien students. Instead, they all leaned forward with genuine interest and curiosity. "Trial and error," Minho added, "but very systematic trial and error. We document every single failure and analyze exactly what each failure teaches us about the system." Professor Nail nodded, slowly, as understanding dawned. "I see you use empirical methodology to build intuitive understanding, rather than using theoretical analysis to develop applied knowledge." "Exactly," Quan said. "Both approaches work well, but they work very differently. Your way produces elegant solutions that perform beautifully under ideal conditions. Our way produces messy solutions that keep working when everything goes wrong." Dr. Zyrus' tentacles rippled with excitement. "And Deathworld conditions mean that everything always goes wrong eventually." "Pretty much," Quan agreed cheerfully. As the class continued, something unprecedented happened in the entire history of galactic academia. The students stopped simply taking notes and started asking real questions. Questions driven by genuine curiosity, rather than just the need to pass examinations. The rigid hierarchy that had always existed between professors and students began to dissolve, replaced by collaborative exploration of ideas. Human directness. combined with alien theoretical knowledge, produced insights that neither species could have achieved. Working alone, by the end of the semester, advanced physics had become the most popular course in the entire university. The waiting list for admission stretched for several years into the future, but more importantly, the fundamental culture of galactic academia began to shift throughout the entire galaxy. The assumption that intelligence could only manifest in one traditional way crumbled completely. In the face of demonstrable human competence, Quan, when asked by reporters about his role in this massive transformation, simply shrugged in that particularly human way. "We just showed them that different does not mean inferior," he said. "Sometimes it takes a practical demonstration to make a theoretical point clear." And across the galaxy, as news of the changes at Galactic University spread to other worlds and institutions, they began quietly reviewing their own assumptions about intelligence, capability, and the dangerous tendency to underestimate anyone who thought differently than they did.